So I wanted to, we've touched on this on and off over the months, but I wanted to revisit this topic of working with shame and what does practical Dharma offer us there, and especially in the realm of self-forgiveness, which I think can be a pretty good antidote to toxic shame. And you know, shame can be one of the most challenging emotions that we deal with. It's one of the primary triggers, at least toxic shame is for reactivity. We can really get reactive when we have a shame attack or feel shame. The internal form of it is self-criticism, self-loathing. The outward is often to strike out, uh, much violence in humans is has shame as its trigger, and we feel it when we violate an internal or external standard to which we subscribe, and often we do that unconsciously. But or when someone points out something that makes us feel we have violated that standard, or the other source, which is pretty frequent, is when we compare ourselves to others, or cultural values of success and beauty and wealth, and find ourselves lacking. So I should be wealthier, skinnier, smarter, whatever. Um, so we accumulate these small humiliations over time from comparison, which contribute to our threshold. We all have a different threshold for when we feel a shame attack. But sometimes it comes from our childhood, sometimes it comes from cultural values, it can come from all kinds of places. But when someone points out that we're bad in some way, you failed at this, you're bad at this, you're a bad person, you're a mean person, whatever, that can really do it. But the result in all cases is I am bad. It's an ego thing. My ego says I am bad, I am defective, I'm not as good as. And the focus is on this sense of self. It's on our ego because the ego is the thing that is wounded by shame. The ego, it's our sense of self-worth that is diminished. So we work very hard to cover up our perceived defects, perceived being the operative word there, not necessarily real defects, but our perceived defects. I am inadequate in this way. I am inadequate in that way. So we work very hard to avoid feeling the shame. And with toxic shame, with unhealthy shame, and I'll define that in a minute, we feel flawed, we feel unlovable. For example, if I don't live up to certain perfectionistic standards, I must be flawed or defective. This is negative shame. This is toxic shame. Now, I want to contrast that with so-called healthy shame. This is an inborn sort of hardwired emotion, helps us govern our socially appropriate behavior. It's necessary for acceptance in our social group. Mild forms of this would be embarrassment or feeling self-conscious around others. A strong form would be humiliation. When we feel humiliated, sometimes we just want to crawl under a rock somewhere. But healthy shame, on the other hand, which means less intense, less toxic, is a source of positive morality. It puts the brakes on, it helps us put the brakes on unskillful or socially unacceptable behavior or action. So, in anticipation of feeling shame, we avoid engaging in immoral acts, illegal acts, socially offensive or unacceptable behavior. We don't take all our clothes off in the middle of a public square. And, and shame, as with many of our other innate responses, is a vestige of our evolutionary past. So if you think about it, it is an emotion that we believe is hardwired into our species, so that, as I said, we put the brakes on engaging in certain behaviors that might have, in ancient humankind, resulted in being banished. And we still have the remnants of that, so that we don't engage in behavior where the result might be banishment from our family, banishment from our community. And if you think about it, evolution selected for those with a higher tendency for shame, because 200,000 years ago in the savannas of Africa, you know, socially offensive behavior might mean banishment from our tribe, and that certainly meant sudden death. If we were cast out on the savannah without food, shelter, protection of the group, our lifespan was probably pretty short. So people that learn to inhibit those behaviors, to stay in the tribe, to stay accepted by the tribe, evolution selected for that. But it becomes a problem and triggers reactivity when we attack ourselves for not meeting an arbitrary rather, usually perfectionistic standard. If the experience, and we see this, if the experience is sufficiently extreme, intense, suicide is a common response in highly shame-prone cultures. We often think about this. Certainly happens in our own culture, but the sort of best example of this is in Japan. If I do something which brings shame upon my corporation, very often, I jump out of a window. It's that powerful. But healthy shame, in contrast, and it's a very important distinction because I don't want to leave the impression that all of it is bad. Healthy shame is the guardian of ethical and moral behavior, and that's how it is viewed in Buddhist teachings. Okay, it's the thing that keeps us from engaging unskillfully or in harmful ways. But the suffering from toxic shame and the reactivity that gets triggered often comes from our clinging, usually unconsciously, to this idea that we must live up to an unrealistic, if not perfectionistic standard in all aspects of life. We have to protect this facade, what would sometimes call the false self that we create to show the world, not have it exposed, not have our flaws exposed. And one of the most unfortunate results of toxic shame is that that when we are in the grip of it, we don't connect with others. We want to withdraw. We want to hide. We don't want to be seen. We don't want people to see what we think are our obvious flaws. We feel voiceless. We feel helpless. We don't want to be exposed for our imagined defects that seem so clear to us. We do what we can in those situations to avoid feeling small and defective. And sometimes that is just to hide it, go hide somewhere. Or we, on the flip side, sometimes we deal with it by wielding power over others in abusive and unskillful and harmful ways. Much domestic violence has shame at its base. I feel small, I feel defective, so I wield harmful power over you to try to restore some feeling of wholeness. And we see this all the time in violence. If I'm with my peers and you come up on the street and you disrespect me, I have to correct that wound, usually with violence. So it's a very problematic. Toxic shame is a very problematic emotion in our culture and in most culture. Okay. And again, the ego comes into play because it's the ego, our sense of self, which suffers the shame. So what practices from the Dharma help us better manage it? Well, we begin, as we always do, with noticing. When we are aware that we're caught in a toxic shame attack for some perceived failure, some perceived misstep, we begin by reminding ourselves that this is a shame attack, and that it's going to thrive if we isolate. It's going to grow under the cover of darkness. Meaningful connection is a powerful antidote to shame. If I can come to you and say, I'm really feeling, I trust you, I'm really feeling inadequate, I really feel like I screwed this up, just voicing that sometimes can lessen it. Because it helps us accept our imperfections. It helps us accept our humanity. We all suffer from imperfection and flaws. So we start with noticing, and then comes self-forgiveness, okay, which includes several elements. We forgive ourselves for our screw-ups. We forgive ourselves for our perceived flaws. The first step there, which will not surprise you, is self-compassion. Okay, we work on feeling compassion for ourselves, for our defects, for our failings. We work on letting go of any regret we have about the behaviors. We work on letting go of the standards that trigger the shame. We make them conscious. Oh, I'm feeling like I have to be perfect in this situation. You know, that's just impossible. That's only going to make me feel bad when I'm not. We remind ourselves that making mistakes, having poor judgments, doing things we know we shouldn't in the heat of the moment are a natural part of the human experience. None of us are perfect. None of us can avoid making mistakes. None of us avoid acting unskillfully in the heat of the moment. You know, one of the things that I've really struggled with in my own practice over the years is making peace with my humanity, you know, warts and all. It's not that I don't aspire, you know, to grow and develop, but it's working to not hold myself to some impossible ideal. And often that impossible ideal is not conscious. We have to say, wait a minute, what are the standards? You know, what am I expecting of myself? The less I expect myself to be perfect, to never mess up, the more likely I'm going to make headway in self-forgiveness and self-acceptance. And when I look back, you know, I can easily be embarrassed at what I used to say, the views I espoused, the self-centered arrogance that I exhibited as a younger person. You know, I've tried to work with that. I try to remind myself that this is part of living, of growing up, of being human, and realizing that on our path there is no time but now. The future's an illusion. It's just a what if. You know, the past is past. You know, the only reality we have, the only reality we have access to is the present moment. So with that in mind, self-forgiveness is to stop trying to fix our past and feeling ashamed of it. Stop trying to make it better. It's giving up all hope of improving that which has already happened. All we can do with it, we can beat ourselves up for it, which is the shame piece, or we can forgive ourselves of it. I did the best I could at the time. One obstacle is the fact that in our minds, we have this resistance to feeling pain, even if it happened a long time ago. So we work with it thinking we can fix it. Well, that's just not going to happen. We spend so much time in our head replaying, rehashing, arguing with ourselves. But is it not more skillful to acknowledge that tender, vulnerable part of ourselves, feel the sadness, feel the loss, feel the regret, and the pain that has occurred, and then forgive ourselves, feel compassion for them? You know, self-forgiveness allows me to understand the conditions of a period in my life when I acted unskillfully. You know, by doing that, by setting an intention to do that, I'm able to release some of the judgment and shame that I carry around. My skillful behavior happened at the time due to a painful set, and this is true for all of us, of causes and conditions in our life at the time. You know, think about all the ways we were unable to accept ourselves. You know, this is not denying it or glossing over it or trying to make it all better. It's trying to accept it, forgive ourselves, and then let it go. You know, would it not be more skillful to turn the light directly on the areas of painful regret and extend it a loving hand, extend it a forgiving hand? In this way, our practice of forgiveness becomes a positive habit of the mind. If we begin to practice it, we begin to embrace it. It allows us to release judgment, to release regret, and to release that torment of shame from the past. You know, it opens up our capacity for a loving heart toward ourselves and others. So it's a very important practice. It's a very important way of trying to move off some of the suffering that comes from all of this shame that we carry around and the standards that we adhere to that produce it. So enough from me. Let me get your thoughts. Let us share some thoughts.